Bias binding is something that I use an awful lot in my projects, whether it's making things like purses and bags, if I'm quilting, or if I'm making any kind of crafty items, or even homewares like cushion covers. The reason being, I think it gives a lovely outline to whatever it is that you're making, or it can be practical as well. So if you're making something that literally can't be folded over twice to make a hem because your fabric's too thick, maybe it's a pair of oven gloves, maybe it's even something like a quilt, then bias binding is your only option. If you weren't aware of exactly what bias binding is, it's basically a strip of fabric that's cut on the bias, and the bias is a 45-degree angle. Now the reason for that, if you're cutting on the straight of a grain, you've got the one weave going up and one weave going across. So you've got your warp and your weft. The warp is the one that goes up and the weft is the one that goes across. If you're cutting on a 45-degree angle, you actually get a little bit of movement in your fabric. So therefore, if you're drawing this around a curve, it's not going to pucker. Now there's a couple of different ways of cutting your fabric if you're going to make your own. Obviously you can buy bias binding, but I just think it's so much nicer sometimes to be able to make your own, because then you can have exactly the length that you want in the fabric and the width that you need as well. So you'll notice on your mat you have your 45-degree angles. You'll have other angles as well, and then the same on your rotary cutter. So I've got 45, I've got 30, 15 and 60. 45 is the one that we're going to concentrate on here. So when I'm going to cut my fabric, I'm going to make the first cut on that 45 degrees, which is from here to here. For the most part, I use 1 inch wide bias binding, which is actually a 2-inch strip of fabric, and that's cut into, I fold it into 1 inch pieces when it goes through the bias tape maker. Now I've got that 45-degree angle. The easiest way to cut more is to use the 2-inch mark on my ruler. I can line this up with a mat as well if I wanted to really belt and braces it, but 2 inches on here. Line that right up to the edge of my fabric, and then with my rotary cutter we're going to cut. Always cut away from you and lock your guard when you're using a rotary cutter. What we never want to see is that cutter coming towards us, because these are very, very sharp. So keep everything away from you as you're cutting. You may find it useful as well to put a little bit of pressure as you're cutting, particularly with thicker fabric. So standing up, and always make sure that your blade is sharp, may help there a little. So this is how I'm going to carry on cutting until I've got the length that I need. The next thing I need to do is to join the pieces together. So we'll just show you on these 2 pieces here, because the obvious thought is that when you join these together, you join the 2 seams here. So let's flick it over right sides together, and sew with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You will find if you do that, when you fold your fabric back over again, it won't actually line up. You're going to have a step in it that looks a little bit like that. So what you're going to do is to place the fabric so that it overlaps like so, and then you're going to sew, and you can draw a line if you wish to make it a little bit more accurate, from one of those right angle corners across to the other right angle corner. Now it does mean that there'll be a little bit more waste, but you will get that perfect seam. So now I've sewn, I'm going to trim back quite close to the seam, so within 1/4 inch away from that seam. I'm going to chop off those little pointy bits. And then I have that perfect seam. So make this as long or as short as you wish. If you find that your fabric's a little bit floppy, then spray starch will help no end to keep your creases nice and sharp. Okay, then put your iron on. And you're going to need one of these. This is a bias binding maker. And again, as I said previously, I use a 1-inch bias binding, so I need a 2-inch strip of fabric to go into that 1-inch, and that's the same with all of the different sizes. You can buy these in any size that you like, from tiny, tiny little applicators that do things like Cornelli work to really quite wide ones, and there are single fold bias binding makers available as well if you're using these for quilting. So what you're going to do here is to thread your fabric into the maker. They all look pretty much the same, there's different colours and things like that, and then pull that through, and you'll already start to see the fabric folding as it comes through. So always allow a little bit extra. Don't ever cut this to the exact length that you need, because you will need a little bit extra. There's a handle on the top here, and then all I'm going to do is to put the iron over the fabric, and then as I draw back the bias tape maker, I'm going to press with my iron as I go. So it's almost like a little factory. It's creasing it at exactly the right fold so that these two edge pieces join exactly in the middle. And it's really quick. You can make your bias tape as long or as short as you actually need it. Now I'm just coming up to the seam there, and this is why I trimmed down the seam as close as I could to the stitches. So probably, you know, within that 1/4 of an inch or 1/8 of an inch, and that'll keep it nice and neat as you go underneath the bias tape maker, like so. There we go, and just carry on ironing, until you get the length that you need.